Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us here at the Bainbridge Island Senior Center for Something to Talk About. I'm Ann Lovejoy, and I'm going to facilitate our conversation today on bias, implicit and blind. Bias is one of those things that is everywhere. It's like the air we breathe and the water we drink. It's so common to our experience that we don't recognize it a lot of times. And it's one of those things that we're seeing more and more these days has really influenced the way our world works. And if we want to change it, we need to take a pretty deep look at some of the things that are implicit in our thinking and in our actions. So I did send around to the Inclusion Study Group, which is not a committee, but a study group of the Senior Center, a little document I prepared about bias. And if you didn't get it and you would like to, you can shoot an email to Reed at the Senior Center and he will make sure you get it. It included a really interesting little link to a set of bias mini tests that were put on a website at Harvard Medical Center to examine different kinds of bias in our lives. And I took those tests, or some of them, and was really fascinated to learn some of the results. For instance, the first one I took was about ageism. And I thought that I liked all ages pretty much equally, but it turns out that I have a very strong bias toward young people, which I thought was interesting. When I checked with my daughter, she said, well, yeah, Mom, you were always a lot warmer to my friends than a lot of the other moms. Not that they were awful or anything, but they just weren't that interested in us. And you're always really interested in younger people. I thought, well, that's kind of cool. But you can look at your bias about the color of someone's skin or the level of their education or their religious or political stance. You can look at how you feel about people who are older or younger or all sorts of things. And it's very enlightening. So bias, implicit bias, biases are taught directly or indirectly through our lifetimes through parents, teachers, neighbors, friends, advertising, media, etc. And the term implicit bias explains how our attitudes towards people or stereotypes with them were formed without our conscious knowledge. And bias blind spots are places where we can see bias operating in others, but we can't see it in ourselves and in our own worldview. And the quote is, everyone thinks that they are less biased than their peers, which is true, right? I think that's even historically very established that we can obviously see where other people are having issues, but we don't see our own. And that's one of those pieces where I think these days, with so much media attention on a lot of the implicit bias in our country and in our culture, we're starting to recognize some of the places where we ourselves are biased and hadn't really been aware of it. And I'm just curious if any of you have experiences like that you'd like to talk about.
I would like just to reference the church book group. And we're reading a book called Cast with an E. Mm-hmm. That delves into the background of bias.
It sure does. Mm-hmm. Have you discovered anything in it that was of interest to you particularly?
Well, I grew up in southwestern Virginia and didn't feel biased. But obviously I was, because it was all around me. So I've gone back over a lot of that in my head in the last month reading this book.
Yeah, has anyone else read Cast? It's by Elizabeth, what's her name, Wilkerson, who wrote The Warmth of Other Suns. A very interesting study of the way our culture is dominated by a caste system we don't acknowledge.
Yeah.
I'd like to mention two books.
Okay.
Many months ago, we had at Eagle Harbor Church, we had a session on racial bias, anti-Black bias, or bias about Black matters. And I thought it was a very unsatisfactory arrangement because everybody knows I'm a big jazz fan, as I think Ann knows. I really like jazz and know a lot about it. I think I know a lot about it. And that's affected my racial views on racial differences. So I prided myself on being very non-biased about American racial differences. And the other book just came to my hand from a member of our Shakespeare group, who's our now shut down Shakespeare group, which will return. And it's called Shakespeare and Divided America. It's by a professor at Columbia, an English professor, very bright, very zippy book, very deeply researched on all the implications in Shakespeare literature about things in America, ranging from bias, chauvinism, interstate relations, manifest destiny, or all these big themes in American history. And there's stuff in Shakespeare you would not believe that fits perfectly, up to and including, I'll shut up in a minute, up to and including the production of Julius Caesar that was done in Central Park in an extremely Trumpy way. Big Trump references by the way the lead character was dressed and with a long necktie, and people were killed on stage. And then the production was shut down because it was too Trumpy, too obviously Trumpy. So I thought I was above all that. And I find in this, reading the Shakespeare book, there are lots and lots of prejudices I have that I wasn't aware of. And that's at the end of my long contribution.
I think a lot of us have had that experience of reading books, or especially as I've been reading to my grandchildren, I started pre-reading a lot of books that I had grown up with and read to my own kids. Now I'm reading them through and I'm shocked and sometimes horrified at the racism, the bias, the casual slurs, the sexism, the imperialism. Even like The Secret Garden has this horrible blame the victim, some very strange things. And you think, wow, when I read that as a child, I didn't see any of that. When I read that to my children, I still didn't see any of that. Now, I think we've all had this experience. We've sort of progressively had our eyes opened to more and more of our own bias, but going back and reading things that we had assumed were delightful stories, sometimes that's a really shocking experience. Does anyone else notice that? I see a few heads nodding.
They can be delightful and still be seeded deeply with bias.
Well, sure. Anybody else had that kind of experience?
Well, I can think of Roald Dahl's Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, for one. Peter Pan, for the depiction of Native American people. Yeah, of course, Gone with the Wind, but that's not really a children's book.
We're on.
And Laura Ingalls Wilder, I think her things were criticized quite drastically currently, or relatively currently.
And that book about the Egg and I Road.
Mm-hmm.
It starts with it's a terrible slur about Native Americans right in the first chapter. I could never get past it.
Which book is that?
Betty McDonald's The Egg and I.
Oh, The Egg and I, all about being on Vashon Island.
Well, it's actually, there's an Egg and I Road up by Port Townsend. I think that's the one.
Oh.
Yeah,
but
that's
anyway.
where she was. Don, did you have your hand up, I looked like?
I did. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
I just finished The Warmth of Other Suns, and it brought back part of my growing up years, which was on a ranch in Texas with my grandparents. And I remember getting on the school bus one morning, and I was the first kid on the bus. I must have been 8 years old or maybe 9. And so the bus tapered down toward the back and the seats got smaller and smaller. And so I thought, wow, I'll just go back there and get one of those nice small seats. Driver stops the bus, tromped down the aisle, grabbed me out of the seat. He said, "Don't ever sit back here again. You're white. You belong up front."
Oh,
That was my introduction to
oh,
segregation in the South.
that's something that would never be forgotten.
You bet. That was still the era when drinking
How old
fountains
were
were.
you?
I was 8 or 9 years old. That was still the era when they were drinking fountains that were labeled black and white, and
Sure.
waiting rooms and all those kinds of things. Schools, yeah,
And did you say that was in Texas?
yeah.
Gee whiz.
Eleanor?
Well, I hate to get all schoolmarmy about this, but I wonder if it would be useful to make a differentiation between prejudice and bias. Not that they aren't related to each other, but that the prejudice that is seen in things like the segregated bus are overt, whereas I think bias, I was thinking about this morning, some bias is inherent or covert, and some of it is overt.
Mm-hmm.
That a bias may give us a tendency toward being prejudiced against someone, and maybe that's what I'm trying to get at, is that I think a bias can be positive or negative. That is, I am biased towards something, I prefer something, or I am biased against something. Or maybe that's the distinction I would make. I'm prejudiced against something.
Very good. Can you think of some
And
positive
that makes it
biases?
active.
I think one thing that a lot of us have an experience with is being in a classroom, a mixed classroom, say a math or science classroom, and having the teacher respond much more quickly to male hands than female hands, for instance. And that is a bias that the girls don't really know what they're talking about or don't belong there. In an English class, you might find it reversed, that the girls might get called on much more often as it's a girly topic. That kind of thing, I think, is bias in action. That's not exactly prejudice, but they are, of course, pretty closely linked, right? I think one of the pieces we're looking at is, both are often submerged too. We don't really know their roots until we stop and really consider it and think about, why do I think that? Or why did I reach for this one rather than that one? And start thinking more about where our, what we think are our opinions might actually be someone else's opinions, right?
Yeah, I think as children, we all learn norms, and some of those were very biased. And they get so ingrained into our brains that they become implicit bias. So we're not even aware of them. It's just, I'm in a quote unquote dangerous neighborhood, or, things like that, or that person looks suspicious. It's kind of planted in us really early and really deep.
Right. So some of the instances where people call the police because a person of color is in their neighborhood, not necessarily just prejudice, but it's also a bias, as Peggy was just saying, that we feel like a presence of someone who doesn't look like us is conceivably a threat. That is more bias than prejudice. I think, though, I don't know how much it deeply matters, but I think what really matters is that we do a lot of examining and observe ourselves. And like I said earlier, the blind spot means that it's much easier to see other people's. So I'm starting to think maybe we should have little invitational groups where it's like, I'll tell you yours if you'll tell me mine.
I was on a bus one time in Seattle many, many years ago, and it was in South Seattle. And I was, there were a lot of people of color on the bus. And I got off the bus and started walking away. And a young African-American boy said, ma'am, and handed me my purse. I had left my purse on the bus. But in that moment where this young African-American boy hands me my purse, I'm like, what? It just kind of broke some kind of a mold in me, that I had this idea that, young Black, youth would steal my purse rather than give it back to me. So that was somehow in my brain. And it just kind of really was a moment for me.
Has anyone else had an experience like that where you suddenly realized your assumption was totally faulty? I know I certainly have, where you start to make a comment or have a response or a reaction and then think, wait, I don't really feel like that. I personally sometimes can actually hear voices in my head of a parent or a teacher. Young girls don't do that sort of thing, or young ladies never use that sort of language. Just as an example, not for me, of course, but I think a lot of us were trained to have certain positions in society, not just opinions about people who don't look like us or don't talk like us, but also about our own behavior and what is appropriate and what is not.
No doubt, no doubt.
So what do you do when you bump into that?
You don't make an attempt to erase it. You just, oh, that's interesting. If you even reflect on it, you just say that's interesting to yourself. Isn't that true? I would.
I don't know. I think anymore these days, I think we're apt to start doing a little deeper consideration and thinking, with so much media attention on really egregious crap going on.
I was sitting there thinking, what do you do when you have those realizations? And I don't know if this is a gendered thing or not. But I was raised in the same era, right? Women did certain things and you acted a certain way. And I think that I'm more apt to actually be sort of hard on myself. Like, how dare you? You shouldn't be, really self-critical. And then I can switch to, oh, wait, hang on just a second. Even that is a bias. You need to just stop for a second and rethink this. It's hard. Sometimes the biases build up on top of each other.
Definitely true. And you're right. I think you're right that for women of our age, there was a lot of repression about inappropriate ideas, which was practically any of them.
One of the big revelatory moments for me was in my teaching, and I had a student in the design studio from Indonesia, and her, I've forgotten what it was we were designing, but it was something fairly simple. And her design just kept becoming more and more elaborate. It was, one thing layered on top of another, and visually it was just, becoming incredibly multiplicious. And so I kept trying to pull her back into something simpler. And, the harder I tried, the more she added on. And at some point it dawned on me that the problem was cultural, that in her culture, the better design was the one that added more on, whereas in mine, at least ostensibly, the ethic was to simplify and to make things visually more direct. And it was interesting because I realized I had to talk with her differently from the other students, and to say that perhaps if she was designing this building in Norman, Oklahoma, that it might want to be simpler, but that she certainly had the right to, to express herself in her own terms
and not make them wrong.
Right. It's to say it's not that it's wrong.
And yet I think we're such a binary culture that we are often quite quick to assume that something different is wrong initially.
I think that's absolutely true. We have to identify what's wrong and who's wrong. And once you know who's wrong, you don't have to do anything. You just have to blame them and go on.
Very simple.
In response to what Christina said about, self-regulation and, the things, there's actually a name for that. It's called internalized oppression. So, people get raised in a certain thing, and if they're in the discriminated against class or group, they will actually internalize those messages and think of themselves as lesser, as not as smart as, you know. And you often see this acted out in women when they're so self-effacing around men, and so, don't want to raise their own opinions and things like that. So anyway, it has a name, internalized depression.
And it's not an uncommon experience for anybody who is in a subculture or in a minority culture that's been repressed. I went to a meeting at the Ingersoll Center in Seattle, which is the longest running transgender support center in the world. Started in 1977, and there were group topics offered, and then they asked the groups what they wanted to talk about. And one person put up their hand and said, internalized transphobia. And the whole room just became dead silent. And then about 8 people stood up and walked over and formed a group with that person, because it's such a deep topic. I think that is probably true for many, many underserved communities like that, or communities that have been steadfastly mistreated. And to some extent, of course, for women too. One of the interesting pieces for me when my daughter came out as transgender was that I started to realize that I was trying to help her present in a way that I thought was appropriate, and that my idea of what was appropriate for women to look like and talk like and move like was not the same as her internalized idea. That was really, really an interesting, I had to do a lot of, there's a special technique you develop, it's called zip the lip. But don't stop thinking and observing and listening. And it has been very enlightening for me.
I want to brag about the fact that I've just been trying to do exactly that.
Well done, Charlton. There's just such a strong urge to not uncover our bias for a lot of people, because it's painful to acknowledge places where we have been biased or prejudiced or just plain ignorant or made assumptions that were really incorrect.
We have so many latent feelings. This whole recent issue of the anti-Asian.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm being Asian, and I was sort of brought up saying, don't go out on a limb, don't say too much negative. And with all this latent feeling, and then this whole issue of the Chinese flu and the kung fu and all that, and it's brought a lot of these latent feelings out, and we're seeing this manifested now in all the just the anti-Asian feeling and the violence against Asians. And I don't think too much of it myself, being on this island, but it's in the back of my mind, and it kind of conjures up some of the prejudice that I felt growing up in a white community. So it's interesting to see this manifest now against the Asians.
And it's not the first time. Several of my friends talked about growing up on the island and having people say to them, "Oh, there's never been any prejudice on Bainbridge." They're like, "You have no idea." And I think that's quite true, that we have no idea. But to have no idea implies a willful blindness, because it's always been here, and the signs have been ample, really, for people who were willing to look. But I think it's really tempting for humans to kind of retreat to our comfort place and go, that was just somebody from elsewhere who made that trouble, or, oh, they were just having a tough day, right? Or whatever, making excuses, but not admitting, yeah, we are a deeply, deeply biased culture. And maybe all human cultures are, really. And what can we do to shift our own positions to make the world a little better? I guess that's my hope.
Good.
Strange as it may seem, this is the first something to talk about that I've ever checked in on. I wouldn't have missed this for the world.
Well, thank you. Oh, Katie, now you're here.
Evelyn has her hand up.
Yep, she does. Evelyn, let's hear from you.
Oh, all right. What I've noticed recently, and I'm sure it's just the self-product, but in advertising, we just see Black people and Asian people and mixed race couples and, Asian people more and more. And I think that's a good thing. This last year has been terrible, but all these things are coming out to the front. And I think that is really, and in my opinion, about the best way for all of this to ever change is to have it start early in the schools, the teachers. And, but I think there are a lot of positive things that have come out of these terrible things that have happened this last year.
We can't be totally aware of all the biases we had. If they all crowded in on us, we would be paralyzed. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you.
Back a few years ago, we always have a team meeting when I worked for the Mariners, and I still do. We always have a team meeting ahead of time. And about 3 or 4 years ago, they were having the intersex bathrooms, or whatever you want. I remember this one woman said something derogatory about gay and lesbian people. I don't remember exactly what it was, but all I do remember is the hairs on my back of my neck stood up, and I was angry. I was angry and biased about the fact that she would have the nerve to say anything like that. So I am biased against people who are against people. It happens. Enough said. I mean, it's honest to God that it bothers the hell out of me.
No, but Sheila, I think that's an important point, because we all have those kinds of what we would consider positive biases. And yet I'm not sure it's positive if it causes us then to shut them off. I'm thinking about my current political biases and the fact that I simply will not listen to certain comments, people, etc. And then I realize that's wrong, because it simply dismisses them as of no value. Well, they may have no value, but I should at least ask the question, why do you think that? Or where does that idea come from for you, to engage in a discussion of our different biases?
I am with you, Eleanor. I've taken under consideration the fact that my bias against Fox News, for example, and what I've done is I have listened to Sean Hannity. I have listened to Tucker Carlson for an extended period of time, as long as I can stand it. Anyway, and for example, those two I have listened to. I also go over to OAN, and I go over to Newsmax on a regular basis every day, just to get an idea of where people are coming from. I think what bothered me about the situation that I explained was, this was a friend of mine.
Yeah.
And it surprised me. Shall I say that?
Yeah.
Absolutely surprised me. And I felt, I didn't say anything, but I did maintain that the next time that came up, I would say something. It's never come up again. It's for one reason or another. So, yeah. Should it come up again with her or anybody else, I will say something.
But don't you think that's part of our acculturation too? I mean, we're polite. We don't, you don't call people out publicly. And that's something that we've had to recognize, and I hope in the end get over, which is that it can be done. It doesn't have to be done rudely, I suppose. It doesn't have to be done in the same terms, but that's a way of at least beginning to break down the barriers of bias.
One thing I've learned is that when we respond to that kind of a statement that implies that that person who's making that statement feels completely comfortable, and that person is assuming that everyone else is going to agree, or they wouldn't say it because they would feel vulnerable. So one thing to do is not, I mean, the temptation is like, I can't believe you just said that, or something like that, but to say, this I learned from one of my dear counselor friends. He would always say, oh, what an interesting idea. Say a little more about that. Which is kind of disarming. And sometimes the person will step back, but sometimes they will say a little more about that, and you'll learn a little more. And to say it not, I mean, I've been practicing with my grandkids, right? Who are 5 and 7. And sometimes we get into big arguments. And then I find if I say, you know, we'll say a little more about what's not fair. I'd like to know. And if you're really sincere about it, they'll tell you, and you'll learn that they actually have a very legitimate point, or that they have a very unexamined view. And sometimes that can open a conversation that wouldn't be open if we challenge.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not implying that you agree, but you're implying that you're curious and interested. And if you're a friend, you like that person and you'd like to know more. Does that make sense?
Yes, indeed.
Thank you, Anne. That's perfect.
Yeah, well, I learned it because I needed to learn it, Sheila.
And obviously I do too. So I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Well, it's disarming, like I said, and it's one of those, a good tool to use in any situation where you feel like your own opinions or might flare. It's really good to take a breath and kind of step back a little.
Yeah, I think the only danger with you know, with all of us is to not say anything, which is what we've been taught to do.
Yeah.
So when our uncle comes to the table and starts talking about, you know, those Mexicans or whatever, you know, we've all kind of been taught to like put up with it, be silent around it, you know. And so Anne's solution is a better one because you're actually trying to engage in conversation, you know. And so, but I think that you can actually do damage by just being silent, because you know, silence is consent, is what they say.
I've seen signs saying silence is violence, which actually, when you think about it, it has a point that if we don't speak up, and you know, we have seen you might pay a price for speaking up, but the way we speak up can definitely shape the outcome of whatever happens. One of my friends, Debbie Haase, was participating in a march in Bremerton, a protest march, some time ago, before the pandemic, I think, and said she saw a young man with a very inflammatory sign who was yelling and making horrible comments. And she stopped and went over and started talking to him and said, I'm just curious what you were, what you're doing here. And he actually said, well, I don't know. I just was restless and I saw this thing and I thought I might come and make a little trouble. And she's like, oh, why would you want to do that? And they actually got into a really long conversation. And I was so impressed. She is a practitioner of what's called nonviolent communication, or compassionate listening. And I think that style, it can really open up a lot for both sides of a conversation like that. But the real key is you got to mean it. You have to truly be interested. And sometimes that takes a little bit of practice.
Because if you're not really authentic and interested, it'll show.
Yeah, exactly. It's just another tricky way of being challenging. Yes.
Well, I have just a whole deck of cards that I want to share and think about. I loved that there's someone here who kind of confessed that they hadn't really thought about things this way before. And I just welcomed that person and love that they're here. And the thing about biases, and maybe it's good that we don't know them all. Actually, as far as a function of your brain couldn't function if you knew all of the generalizations you made and you knew all the biases that you have. And so that goes back to, well, what do we do about it? And I heard somebody say, yeah, well, it would be really painful if we knew all the biases. And I think that's kind of a white-centered thing, because I think white people don't want to know, our biases that look down on people and stuff. So I just suggest that rather than thinking of it as painful, maybe thinking of it as work. It's your share of the work. It's your share of the work to recognize what your bias is and decide what your response will be in each situation. And the only example that I thought I'd share is just the time when I sat down on a plane next to a young woman, a beautiful Black young woman, and I wanted to be a cool person. And so I thought in my head I would talk about this like soul music that I like. And then I thought, well, what if she doesn't like soul music or something? Or I didn't even say it that way, but it was like, gosh, I'm assuming she likes soul music. And so I just simply said, I love music. I'm trying to decide what to listen to. It turned out she was in a symphony as a string, you know, like as a violin player. Now, as we went down, you know, as we spent time and we got to know each other, you know, she appreciated my love of certain kinds of music, but I was so glad that I happened to not say something about pop music or soul music. And I think that that's a little bit of an exercise too, is whenever you have that whiff of a bias, try to just turn it inside out and think, well, what if that's not the case? And then asking those questions, you know, checking those assumptions. But I think it's an incredible opportunity. It means we always can learn more about each other and we can always find new connections with each other. So it's work, but it's a way to build community, you know, too.
What do you do when you see somebody else's bias blind spot? Do you do anything at all?
It depends who it is, doesn't it?
I guess it probably does.
It definitely depends who it is, who else is in the room, what my consciousness is, if I'm grounded or I'm not grounded. And I've tried to articulate just, I'm uncomfortable about that. You know, I've tried to articulate, like, kind of role play different things so that I'm not, like you said, silence is violence. I do believe that. But you have to be compassionate and try to figure out what the work is in that moment.
A friend of mine said that she and her husband were at some kind of fundraising event, fancy fundraising event, and the couple, one of the couples sharing their table, the fellow made an offensive racial supposed joke. And she said they were shocked and horrified, but didn't say anything. And so we talked about that and I said, you know, in a situation like that, there's a number of ways to go about it, but, you know, it's probably pretty valuable to raise at least the point that you don't share that, you don't appreciate that kind of comment, and to point out that it's not just a joke. And we talked about it for a while, and then sometime later she came back really pleased and happy with herself and said, we found an opportunity, and we were alone with the couple, to call that out and sort of say, you know, when that happened, we were so shocked and unhappy we didn't know what to say. But I'd like to talk a little more about it, because for us, that's pretty racist. And the guy's like, oh, it's just a joke. And she's like, yeah, well, they really had thought about enough to have a conversation available to kind of follow their own inner script. And she was so happy about how that worked out. And I thought, yeah, sometimes we have to practice, because it is hard to know in the moment. And many of us do have the deep inner instruction to not rock the boat, or to not be rude, or to not call somebody out in public. And often that's appropriate. But I think it is kind of a valuable thing to kind of do those practice. Like when you wake up at 2 a.m. thinking, I wish I'd said, you know, write it down. So you start to get a little sense of how to respond maybe a little more in the moment, if it's appropriate.
I like the thing that you said, Katie, about I'm not comfortable with that.
Mhm.
I like that statement. That makes all the sense, because it doesn't put anybody down. It's an I statement. It's me saying it. And nobody can say, well, you shouldn't feel that way, because that's the way I feel. But, to be able to say to someone, I'm not comfortable with what you just said.
And I would like to see what's happened on this front after we were under different conditions, which might be 6 months from now.
It's true.
Would you promise to do that?
Well, I can't promise, but I think it's a good point to raise, and I'll talk to Reed about it. We don't usually have follow-ups on these conversations, but I think each time we enter into one, they're all kind of related, really. The whole point of the inclusion study group when we started it, I don't know if I've ever told you how this started, but the senior center got a letter from a gal who said, how do I know that I'm welcome at the senior center? And Reed, of course, called her and talked to her, but I did too. And then we spent 2 hours on the phone, and she was saying, if I don't see anyone there who looks like me, what would make me know that I was welcome? And I thought, this was worth talking to everybody about. And it turned out that the center as a whole had sort of an implicit impression that we were very welcoming and friendly. But what's implicit is not always explicit. And so that was something we really started thinking about. So I literally invited 8 of my friends to be token this and that's, and they graciously agreed. And we sat down at the table and started talking about what we could do in terms of programming and services that would help us learn to be more inclusive, explicitly inclusive. And in fact, we discovered, looking at our programming, I did a little analysis of all the programming we'd had in the last 3 years, and found that we actually had represented a lot of different viewpoints, at least. That was encouraging. But as the study group grew, it sort of took on a life of its own. Eleanor, you were one of the very first people in that too. And one thing we started doing is looking at things like signage and so forth. But of course, COVID made all that irrelevant. And so we started focusing more on these conversations. But now we've expanded the topics quite a bit. And last summer we were joined by some of the high school kids whose grandparents were involved at the senior center and some of their teachers. And they wanted to talk about different things like how they could help support seniors do safe protesting when COVID was first being, when the pandemic was first announced, and we didn't know how to protest safely as older people, and they offered to make a car caravan for us or something. We never really did do that, but they were curious too about how some of us have managed to be activists our whole lives and not burn out. And of course we said, oh, we do burn out, but then we light back
on a
up.
regular basis.
Yeah, exactly. But it's been fascinating. So the students and the teachers actually put on a couple, asked if they could do a presentation or two, and are going to do some more. And now we're working with the Multicultural Advisory Committee at the high school to try to figure out some times and dates when the students can do more presentations with us, which I think is just great. And there are over 70 people on my contact list now from that original 8. So I think it's showing me, at least, that this community is really interested in stretching, in listening and learning, and being uncomfortable, because that's one of the premises, I think, of all this work, is that we have to accept that we're going to be uncomfortable at various times, and that's part of, as Katie says, that's part of the work. And if we're all uncomfortable together, maybe that makes company. Evelyn.
Yes, I was thinking if all of us would take the bias tests and then get back together and talk, it might be really interesting if we could find out, because I'm sure we're all going to discover some things we didn't know.
Yeah, I think that's really awesome. What a great idea. And I have to say that when I started taking them, I was kind of nervous. And the thing is, it's this test where you click 2 different computer keys with the, one with the, and I'm not that coordinated. So I was worried that the tests were designed for younger people with quicker reflexes, perhaps. But I think on the whole, they came out pretty fair. Then I started to get intrigued, and then it's kind of fun to look at, well, what do I think about that? I don't even know what I think until I surprise myself a little.
Yeah. Is this a good time, Anne, for me to go ahead and
Yeah, please do.
follow up to the topic of lost closet years that we did 3 weeks ago?
Yes.
Judging from the feedback, it was pretty well received. We're now giving some thought to what could be a next step for the LGBT members of the Senior Center to come together as a visible group, maybe for activities like a potluck once a month, and we can do those kinds of things again. Maybe offer an LGBT themed movie open to anyone, such as the movie Brokeback Mountain that I looked again last night, and it broke my heart again all over again. And then perhaps every so often have an LGBT related topic with invited presenters, one of our daily topics, for something to talk about. Just as an example, for those of you who are on Yes Magazine's daily A Better World Today, they offered the article called Unions and LGBTQ Workers Could Be a Powerful Marriage. And it speaks about the discrimination against LGBT people in employment that still exists today. State laws to the contrary.
Yeah.
And now how the recently formed National LGBT Workers Center supports the group of unions to fight against ongoing discrimination. And anyway, anything we do, I hope, will contribute to the goal of a greater sense of belonging to our Senior Center by its LGBT members, including myself. So lastly, I'd like to invite any of you, particularly if you're already members of PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, who identify as gays and lesbian, to let Anne or me know if you'd be interested in working with us to make all this happen.
Or to let other people you know who might be interested, tell them to get in touch.
Thank you, Anne.
Yeah. And when we get to meet again, we would love to do, we had planned to be, the Senior Center was planning to do, have a booth at Pride. Of course, we haven't been able to do that, and probably won't this year again, but we certainly wanted to extend our welcome. And I would love to put on some programs like that. So definitely let's talk some more.